what's the box look like? And for the financial analysts, they're looking at what do the dollars look like, right?
Yeah.
So you take that box that's been sketched out, or even just the raw numbers. You can do the raw numbers from a software tool like PropZone and plug it in, and then you go and get your actual feasibility study from an architect or a civil engineer, and they say, well, that's not going to work.
So more from concrete strategy. So we got pretty detailed in your previous experience for one of your huge mixed-use projects here in Miami.
Mm-hmm.
But this one, I wanted it to be a little bit more educational and structured around some of those specific terms you use, like FAR requirements, and it to help someone anywhere in the country go and decipher the zoning code and understand what they can and cannot build.
Yeah. So with the technical details of the zoning code, which aspects do you want to dive into?
Yeah, so I guess let's start with the basic requirements for a site, right? So when I go into PropZone, for example, or just quickly identify, all right, what can be built, we're looking at unit count, parking, building height, and total FAR. So yeah, can you help give a general overview of how you think about it, how you read it, and how you get to a highest and best use?
First, I hope these episodes are always educational, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think that you're giving away a little bit of the secret sauce by mentioning PropZone.
Okay.
But yeah, the ability to use your software and see what all of your zoning constraints are is one of the big key pieces of doing real estate development and doing it well. And that's just really where it starts, though, is looking at the high level site constraints that you just mentioned, all of the parking, unit counts, FAR, the amount of frontage that you have, the availability of water or electric. You know, we do urban infill projects, and so we don't have to worry so much about the availability of water. And here in Florida, right, too much water usually, not a lack of it, but the ability to decipher those things and put the puzzle together and do that highest and best use is really what it's all about in the early stage in deciding whether or not you want to move forward with an offer and ultimately pass your due diligence period.
Yeah. And then for me, sometimes I dumb it down to myself, right? Already knowing the market, having the main idea of what would go good on this specific site, on this specific road, surrounded by these other uses. But what we're talking about with the project context and constraint, more the constraint being we have a piece of land, and three-dimensionally, what can we build, just a pure geometry, right?
Yeah, the pure geometry aspect tends to be civil engineers and architects that are doing your initial feasibility studies and the term feasibility study is thrown around a lot in different ways. Yeah. And so for the architectural and engineering side, it's what's the box look like? And for the financial analysts, they're looking at what do the dollars look like, right?
Yeah.
So you take that box that's been sketched out, or even just the raw numbers. You can do the raw numbers from a software tool like PropZone and plug it in, and then you go and get your actual feasibility study from an architect or a civil engineer, and they say, well, that's not going to work, right?
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of developers get off to the wrong start.
Okay. And not to go back on your other projects, but just from experience, what initial challenges do you see sometimes people running into, or maybe you've run into in the past, when there's these requirements that are present under the zoning envelope?
Really the biggest challenge is putting the puzzle together for a large mixed-use project in particular. It's how do you manage the different components allocations and how much of your land space and how much of your airspace right? So land space being the two-dimensional, you're looking on the overhead on a map, and airspace being the three-dimensional of within your height limit. How do you manage which components you want to allocate your space to? And the challenges that I see people running into, even if you go much more simply on the individual property uses, most developments aren't large mixed use like I've worked on, but they're just picking a singular use, and they're not looking at how big does, or your turn radius, right? So if a car is going to make its turn into your driveway, how much room do they need to make that? If you are on a corner lot, how far away from a stop sign do you have to be before your driveway can start? And so there are little things like that that are going to trip people up very early on. And so it's good for you to have a good level of experience and perspective to know which questions to ask your civil engineers and your architects to consider, because an architect might not consider the things that a civil engineer would consider in terms of where does the driveway go in relation to that. So you as the developer are ultimately responsible for making sure that you're doing the due diligence and asking the right questions to the right people.
Yeah, right questions to the experts. You've always told me, know enough to ask the right questions.
Yeah.
So then more, even this is, I would say, your expertise and something that you point out to me quite often in different zoning codes. But like when you're first reviewing a zoning ordinance, which sections do you zero in on and to try and find flexibility, whether that be FAR bonuses, parking reductions, floor area exemptions? How do you go about it? What's your strategy?
So with my legal background, I'm able to skim through a code probably more quickly than most other people. But I'm not necessarily zeroing in on one particular aspect where I'm looking for flexibility. It really is a macro to micro study of things where we look at unit counts and what is the definition of a unit even, because
Yeah.
in legal terms, the definition of things is really what you want to hone in on, and each word has a particular meaning. And I tell the story pretty often about there's a particular court case that came out, and this is going to go a little bit longer than what you probably had intended for this episode. But this particular case had a comma where if you have a list of things where you say it's A, B, C, and D, right? Do you put a comma before and, or do you not when you're listing things like that? That's called the Oxford comma.
Yeah.
Right? There's a court case that was decided that everything turned, which side was going to win was based on the fact that there was or was not a comma in that list of things. So every little detail like that is really going to matter when you're looking for particular types of flexibility. But from the beginning, you don't need to be zeroing in on that amount of detail. You're just looking big picture first, and then looking for opportunities more so than anything. It's either for a mitigating factor because you need some sort of a mitigating factor for some other issue that you've run into, or you're just reevaluating your plan and looking for other opportunities for more revenue generating spaces or things like that. But from the very beginning outset, you don't necessarily need to do that.
Yeah. And then a good example of how we see it happening here in Miami too is there's a lot of condo hotels. Now, if you want to touch on, right, so there's buildings that are built, sold as condos, but essentially turn into hotels. And most hotels are designed to be a hotel, right, with back of house space. In the code, it's the amount of keys, right? Or I don't know, it depends what code you're looking at. Keys versus units. So little things like that directly impact the city and the design and the whole market.
What's funny, I mean, you have your paper here, but we actually didn't talk about this, but right before coming over here, in my building, where I live has a WhatsApp group, and they're actually talking about this type of a project that's being built. And I've looked at the plans, and previously they had waivers for the way that they were set up for their parking. And I knew that they were seeking approvals as a hotel. Hotels have a lower parking count per key than residential units have per unit, right? So essentially you're creating a lower parking requirement by seeking a hotel-based approval as opposed to seeking a condo-based approval. Because a condo, typically you're going to have it based on the number of bedrooms that you're putting in. And on a hotel, you can put in multiple bedrooms, but it's still zoning-wise a hotel, parking-wise, getting the hotel benefit. And so in Miami in particular, it's a very quickly evolving space because there's so many of these projects happening. And the zoning code has so much flexibility for developers that in my mind, there's a lot of things that are going to have to shake out from a macro standpoint before the city decides how they want to start to regulate it differently, which I think ultimately they will end up doing, but it might be 5-10 years from now.
We see developers continuously get more creative. Now we're seeing the short-term condo rentals allowing for a deeded office space that you could also put on Airbnb. And it's pretty cool to see, but it all depends on what's in the zoning code.
Actually, I know you've looked into that. So you tell me a little bit more about what you've seen there.
So high level,
based
based off of what I see, right? Marketed as we could go buy in one of these new buildings. We buy the condo and we could, of course, put it on Airbnb, but we also have a deeded office space. So essentially a small room also in the building that we only have access to, but you could also rent it out to someone that may be in town for a business trip. So making it lucrative for the buyer and end user. But again, is that office space, what does that consider? Because it's deeded to the residential unit that can act as a hotel, but also, is like, what does that square footage count as? It can't be office because it's attached to the unit.
Well, and this kind of goes to what I was saying in our last conversation about the labeling of your space as commercial, right?
Yeah.
So all of it's commercial activity, right? Hotels, retail, office, that's all commercial activity. And so is it all the same stuff or is it not? And every city is going to have a different way of looking at it.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, the creativity that people will find. And once people hear about it and once someone makes a killing on a project, how many others are going to pop up?
Exactly. But just how important it is for the legal back work to understand, what you can and cannot do. And then, of course, we're seeing that with the local act. This at the state level saying you can go and do this. Specific counties are pushing back on it. And that's a whole different episode.
Yeah.
But back to the educational purposes for this one. Yeah, so specific question. Can you describe your process for identifying hidden allowances, like switching a door location or adjusting a hallway dimensions to squeeze out extra square footage? And I know from experience now with our current project, it's a matter of sitting down with all the consultants, but anything you could give tips on would be beneficial.
Yeah, so as I was mentioning with the retail, the height limit, and then the retail expansion, and then the FIR becoming really the primary constraining factor, we had to start to evaluate a lot of different opportunities for shaving back what is FAR. And so we had a pretty vague definition of what FAR is, and we had heard that certain areas didn't count as FAR. And so you can actually go to a city and get an opinion from either the city attorney or city manager or whoever might have the authority to do so. And they'll tell you, hey, this type of a space does or doesn't count. So that's one thing, is, again, getting clear definitions. And then you can go and take those definitions and apply them to your site. And with the consultants, you want to have your engineers, your architects, and your GC all sitting there with you, and then your financial analyst or yourself, and thinking about the market basis for it. And so as the developer, you're probably the one most well-informed out of that group to think about what's the actual end user experience going to be like. That's generally what we're driving towards, is figuring out the end user experience, which in turn determines your income, that is the revenue for everything, right? The basis for it. And so we were on our thesis project and even the lifetime project had to do quite a bit of reconfiguration of spaces, exactly like you're saying, with a door that the architects originally had designed out to the edge of the exterior of the building. We pulled it back. So now that's an exterior space and doesn't count as FAR. Or even elevator lobbies, making those as non-interior spaces. So there's a lot of things that you can look at, but it really is about you having the vision as the developer and making sure that your whole team is in agreement with what you're doing cost-wise and design-wise, that you're not making mistakes.